So, Kamal, the French elections, second round of voting. It's interesting, this, isn't it, to do one round of voting, have a pause, have a period of reflection, and then ask the electorate to come back. And in this case, the first round of voting had basically given a pretty strong victory to Marine Le Pen's National Assembly. But now there's been a recalibration of the electorate, maybe a bit of tactical voting, and the new Popular Front, which is that uneasy sort of alliance of centre-left Greens and far-left politicians. The bottom line is, Kamal, is that new Popular Front left-wing coalition has pushed Le Pen's national rally into third place. So effectively, we've got Macron stuck in the middle in a sort of, I was going to say French sandwich, but is it a croque-monsieur between the hard left on one side and the hard right on the other? And so let's just break down the percentages here. We've got Le Pen's national rally finishing third now, but taking 37% of the popular vote. So we're going to discuss that in a minute, aren't we, Kamal? Because it's kind of popular vote and vote share versus actual seat distribution in the Parliament is...
Slight whiff of the UK's journey last week.
Whiff of reform there, yeah, exactly. The winning Left Alliance took 25%, but ended up with more seats, and Macron 23%. And that is why I would imagine that Le Pen is saying that victory has been deferred. She's waiting in the wings to pounce, and indeed the party leader, Jordan Bardella, the man who had hoped last week to become Prime Minister of France, has basically blamed Macron for putting together an alliance of dishonour to block him from office.
I think the first big takeaway is paralysis, because although Le Pen's party, National Rally, comfortably beat Macron in the European elections and actually more than doubled the number of seats in the parliamentary elections since 2022 because of this huge amount of tactical voting. The centre parties and the left parties basically made a number of pacts all across the country to leave only one candidate fighting National Rally, which meant that this dam could be built against the National Rally actually winning, which has seemed to have worked. But because the popular vote was in the National Rally's favour, as you say, that means that this fight is not yet over.
So this would basically be like Labour and the Lib Dems saying, we'll just stand one of us to beat Nigel Farage.
Exactly that. And because the National Rally, as Henry Samuel, our Paris correspondent, has been writing on the Telegraph overnight and into today, is so bereft of allies in France, it means that that type of tactical voting really works. We now have this period of cohabitation, which is about... I just had a quick run at that. I just had a run at that.
It's really good.
We have some guests in the studio who are actually French, and they're trying not to laugh whilst I'm going through these words. But this period of cohabitation, I won't try that again, means that the problem is that passing legislation, what does France do on these many, many political issues that are facing, well, not just France, of course, but all countries in Europe and across the world? How does that actually work? Because the left, although it has done well in terms of seats here, it does not have enough to have an absolute majority. And so the battle over who will be the next Prime Minister will be a really important one. Gabriel Attal, who is Macron's appointed Prime Minister, has already said, we've already got a whiff now of what's going to happen. He's already said he wants to resign, and Macron has refused it and said he has to carry on. So we have this moment where, and I think this is one of the problems with these two-stage, maybe slightly more proportional systems, or something where there are extra democratic tests put in place. There is no clear outcome, and these things can then drag on. So the voters have voted, but now they've got a situation where there's no clear outcome. So let's go through, Camilla, what these two sides, this left side, which, as you say, is from the centre to the hard left, and National Rally itself, what are they actually proposing? Do you want to go through what the new Popular Front is saying?
The new Popular Front seems to have been energised and emboldened by Macron becoming deeply unpopular with his suggestion that the French should retire a little later at 64. Just for context, I checked my state pension age before I came into this studio. It's 68, which is horrifying. Also, they want to set up a rescue agency for undocumented migrants to facilitate visa applications, so very pro migrant. They want a cap on basic goods to combat the cost of living crisis. They want to raise the minimum wage. They want to fund all this by introducing, or reintroducing, I should say, a wealth tax, cancel many tax breaks for the wealthy, raise income tax on the highest earners, so a very Corbynistic approach. They want France to recognise the state of Palestine within a two-state solution, and they want unwavering support for Ukraine and are supportive of military aid, even though, and we'll get onto this a little bit later, Mélenchon was supportive of Russia's invasion of Crimea, but then pulled back a bit when it came to Russia invading Ukraine in 2022 and said it was wrong.
So Putin can only go so far before the hard left decide that he's gone far enough. I mean, price controls, that is remarkable on these basic goods would be an incredible position for a Western capitalist democracy, a policy to be put in place. Let's look at National Rally, and I think you can see a tone here if I go through the first three of National Rally's policies. Firstly, end birthright citizenship for children born to two foreign parents, reduce access to medical services for illegal immigrants to emergencies only, and limit access to welfare benefits to French citizens only. I'm slightly putting those words in inverted commas, barring dual nationals from holding jobs in what are described as sensitive strategic posts like defence. What are they? A bit suspicious, presumably. And I think those three together, you can see why, for example, the sounds of celebration from those on the left we heard at the top come into place, because there is this nativist tone to what National Rally are putting forward. And you can see why, for example, so many members of the French football team, including Kylian Mbappe, have come out against Le Pen and actually reminded France of its history. It is a colonial power. It has a Francophile background in many, many nations, particularly in the west of Africa. And some would suggest that given the riches that has brought France, that possibly some of these policies are at least questionable.
You then have Macron sitting in the middle, and his agenda is very much pro-free market, reduce the welfare state, cut taxes to encourage investment, be quite harsh on immigration. So basically pitch yourself as the only sensible professionalised outfit to fight both extremes from the centre. Also, I suppose, quite socially conservative, so banning cell phones for under 11s, no social media for under 15s. That would go down really well with my children, Kamal. Also to develop national service. Heard that one before. He was the future once. So lots of solidarité with Monsieur Sunak, and to build new nuclear plants, which is actually a little bit Faragian, and experiment with a 4-day week, if only, Kamal.
So all these things at the moment are actually, we were saying, weren't we, Camilla, what is the French equivalent of a smorgasbord?
Well, is there one? Let's
ask
our guests.
Yes. So you may have heard we have two wonderful guests here. They're slightly trying to suppress their giggles at our pretty bizarre attempts at French pronunciation. But anyway, the wonderful Telegraph journalist and colleague Adelie Pojzman-Pontay, who produces our investigative podcasts, and the freelance journalist Charlotte Can, who are, as we've said, both French. So what
useful,
luck we have.
Really useful ladies to have in the Daily Tea studio.
Situation.
Can I say bonjour and bienvenue sur la Daily Tea podcast?
What is podcast in French?
It's podcast.
Podcast. Great. What is smorgasbord in French?
Podcast.
Le podcast. And what is smorgasbord in French? We need to know. Is it just smorgasbord?
I have no idea. No, I don't think we use that.
No, we don't use that
I don't think
expression.
we have that concept.
We wouldn't be so indelicate in
have
France,
many more
the land of great haute cuisine, to start putting a load of different things on a tray, let's be honest.
Could we call that a planche mixte?
Planche
We
mixte?
could do, I guess. Which is like a mixed cheese and charcuterie board.
We'll eat that later. Well, the first question, I think, ladies, is why has this happened? Why is France in this situation now?
Shall I start?
Yeah, please.
First of all, I am glad you started this podcast by tempering the mood a little bit. Yes, there was a lot of celebration last night in Paris, Place de la République. However, we can hardly sell this as a victory for the French left. It is not. If it's a victory, it's that of this Front Républicain that you've talked about in previous podcasts, where politicians from the mainstream parties gang up in order to block a possible access to power of the far right, which is exactly what happened. So it worked, okay, except that, as Macron mentioned, and of course the far right too, but Mélenchon threw a spanner in the work by very quickly, and that proves that he's a very fine tactician, I'm not sure he's a fine politician, but definitely a fine tactician, by forming this alliance probably quicker than Macron ever expected. I don't think he saw it coming, to be honest with you, because what we're wondering now is still why Macron organized the snap elections, quite frankly. So a victory for the far left, possibly, but it's a very divided left. I'm saying far left, and I'm sure you're going to correct me. It's not actually being called by the Conseil d'État far left, but many observers think that La France Insoumise, that Mélenchon helms, is a far left party. So we are in this situation today where the Front Républicain worked, but we end up with 3 blocks and, paralysis, the prospect of a hung parliament. How did we end there? We ended there because the French have a tendency to consider that European elections or legislative elections are a referendum. The first round was a referendum against President Macron.
Oui.
The second one was a referendum against le Rassemblement National. That's what happened.
So I think it's a point of semantics that's interesting and that's been brought up in a lot of French media over the last few weeks, but also over the last few years. The far right in Le Pen's National Rally in the last 2 decades has built a very long campaign to kind of get rid of the heritage of Jean-Marie Le Pen's shadow over the party and to de-demonize its legacy in order to build an electable party, which Marine Le Pen has very much succeeded. She's now the third, or potentially the first, one of the first main parties, and she's the first party in the French Parliament and one of the main political blocs. Part of getting rid of that legacy from the 20th century has been to kind of try to get away from the label far right, which they've tried to appeal in a number of administrative spats, but that have always been refused by the highest French legal court, like the equivalent of the French Supreme Court, that does not really label the parties, but that does kind of lay the groundwork for where the parties stand next to, in relation to one another, and in that kind of defining and drawing the political landscape. Marine Le Pen's party has always been considered far right. Now, on the other hand, on the left wing, and you need to remember that in France, the history of the left wing in France is a lot more present than it is in the UK. A good way to put it is our political rainbow has got more colours than it does here. The far right is further than the far right here, but the left has also more shades of red. Mélenchon's party, France Unbowed, has never really been considered the far left. It's considered one of the more radical traditional left flavours. It basically was created in 2016 when the traditional Socialist Party, which is the equivalent to the Labour Party here, kind of blew up between Macron on the one hand, more centrist, more free market, and a more traditional kind of sense of left wing. And then you have the far left, which are some other parties. That's a bit of a point of semantics, but it's important to understand quite the landscape we're working with. I do agree with Charlotte. It's not a victory for them. It's very much a victory for the far right, however, because the tendency that has been set and the wave that has been created since 2002, when Jean-Marie Le Pen came to the second round of the presidential election, is still very much the legacy we're dealing with today. And it's still very much building towards a potential presidential bid and victory in 2027, however.
Adelie, could we just step back a little bit? Why does France... We were talking all last week, and then after the European elections and then the first round of these parliamentary elections after Macron called the snap election. Why does France find itself in a situation where there is still such a powerful voice on the right, whatever you might call it, far right, hard right, certainly some undertones of nativism, some would say racism. Why is that still so prevalent in French politics, and what has been the response of the citizens really to that argument, that this argument is still going on? Why is it still going on in such a obvious way?
I would say it's had a bit of a rebirth since the beginning of the 21st century. One could argue the patterns of that rebirth have been kind of within French society since the 1980s. There is a correlation that has been proven that the vote towards the far-right party, towards Le Pen party, kind of started at the moment when the traditional French left party opened to more free market policies towards the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. And there's a correlation in that. So basically you have a history where left-wing parties that used to protect that were considered protective of French citizens against free market, against deregulation, didn't feel protected anymore and veered towards more protective and protectionist policies that the far right also represents. I think that's, I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, and I think your question is very relevant, but I think your question should also encompass what's happening on the far left. Why are we in a situation today where, in effect, mainstream parties have disintegrated in France? There's been a polarization of the general political discourse. And why are we there? And I think what's happening, and I think it's very French, a very cultural thing going on here, is this disconnect between reality and economic reality in particular and perception. And we've got to ask ourselves why. And I think we're going to talk about it later on. Media, social media, who knows? But the French are profoundly dissatisfied with their politicians, always. They always end up hating their president. And France is a country full of contradiction, of course, but there's this paradox between, this revolutionary streak and this desire for almost paternalistic order, which is represented by both extreme ends of the political spectrum. So there's this inner tension, but we've got to ask ourselves why we are there and why there's this disconnect. Because if you look at the stats, the French economy is not performing very well currently. I think the latest figures, I've got them here, it's 0.2% of growth for the second quarter. Of course, COVID, just like in the UK, derailed the recovery that President Macron, you have to admit it, had started to put in place through a series of measures to, you mentioned it, open up the market and bring more flexibility to the French economy. But it's not, 0.2% is not disastrous, is it? And if you look at other indicators like access to health, for instance, the French have one of the best healthcare systems in the world. And that's from OECD, by the way. There's this survey of perception of quality of life, access to education, etc. And France tends to fare fairly well. So why are people so unhappy?
And why, Charlotte? Tell us.
It's cultural. You often say in the UK that you start a conversation by talking about the weather. In France, we tend to talk about something we disagree about. Okay, so we tend to start the conversation with something a bit controversial, or we start a conversation by moaning a little bit. It's a way to create, a form of social bond. So there's the fact that it's cultural. We've got a long tradition, of course, of revolutions and changes in France. We're very proud of it. And that's another part of the French paradox. If you ever got to work with the French, you'd find out they are actually very hierarchical. And they like vertical structures. Okay, so it's complicated. That's the least you could say. It's a very complicated nation. And is there some form of manipulation? That's a big question. And possibly. Whenever I'm in France, people have the TV switched on a lot, and we've got those round the clock channels, and the political debate there is very, very fierce, and people, the French are deeply political. We are political animals, much more so than the UK, I would say. So people are constantly debating. I mean, we like to intellectualize a lot, too much, if you ask me. But we've got access to a lot of information, and there's a lot of controversial debates going on TV, on the radio, everywhere. You're surrounded by politics. And I think it fosters this constant need to have an opinion on something and to have a controversial opinion in particular, etc. So there is basically a culture of conflict I can't put it in better words. And you mentioned earlier the resurgence or the rebirth of the Rassemblement National. And I think that's another interesting factor, the fact that Bardella was very present on TikTok and social media, and that the demographics of the far-right vote have also changed, with many more youngsters actually being attracted to their program and their desire to curb immigration.
What's interesting, and we were discussing this earlier, is like the political line from far left to far right. And actually, there is a point where it just joins up into a circle. And that point for both Mélenchon and Le Pen is the EU. Both of them are sceptical about the EU and membership of the EU. And I wondered what that actually means for France, but also maybe, Adelie, for Britain, because we've got Starmer now Prime Minister. He's going to have to go and negotiate with whoever is the Prime Minister once that's decided. And indeed, there could be a change of presidency while Starmer is in the middle of his 5-year term. I wonder what that means, for instance, for stopping the boats.
The new Popular Front has come quite strongly pro-immigration and pro-creating rescue agencies. There have been a number of scandals in France in the last few years about the police not helping the boats, not helping sinking boats, even making jokes about drowning people while delaying rescue missions. So it's been quite a heavy topic and a very controversial one. They've also come very much against one of Macron's major reform on immigration, which was which was a very harsh, which was considered by the French left very harsh law. I would say it will be interesting to see who the Prime Minister is, because it's not set to this day that the new Popular Front will decide on Mélenchon. At the moment, in the result of the parliamentary, because it's a coalition, you've got 3 main groups. You've actually got 4 groups in the new Popular Front. You've got the Green Party, the traditional Socialist Party, which is the French equivalent to Labour, French Unbowed, which is Mélenchon's party, and then you've got the French Communist Party. In the last few years, the Socialist Party had kind of exploded after Hollande's presidency because he was so unpopular, and the left-wing people traditionally had kind of felt very much betrayed by his line of politics. But they've very much been reborn from their ashes. And in this parliamentary election, it's actually the first time that they almost have the same number of elected MPs as France Unbowed, which is Mélenchon's party. So it could very well be, it's going to be a very interesting debate of whether Mélenchon becomes PM or Raphael Glucksmann, who's the head of the Socialist Party, in which case it could lead to very, very different attitudes towards the EU.
Charlotte, just give us your view on what's going to happen next. What's going to happen over the next 6 months? Let's put it no longer than that. Is it going to be this sort of paralysis, as we're talking about, where they can't discover a new prime minister? And how does that relationship work with the president?
Kamal, I'd love to be able to address your question, but I literally cannot. We have no idea. Will Macron resign? Will he try to form an alliance with, the left, the moderate left or the moderate right? At the moment, we have this huge lack of visibility. And there's another point I wanted to make during this podcast, actually, because there's a topic that's very much at the heart of the French elections and at the heart of most elections here in Europe, and it's the economy. We haven't talked about the economy very much. And you went through their main action points for the action points of all the main parties to help revive the ailing French economy. But if you look at both the far right and the France Insoumise, or can I call it far left? Is it acceptable? And the far left program, they're very similar in many ways. It's all about the pouvoir d'achat, because that's what was at the heart of the election. There's been a lot of talk about inflation as well, although it was at its highest, I think, just half the rate of the UK, which was almost double digits, wasn't it? Just after the pandemic. So a lot of talks around that, but no real idea about how we are going to find all this money we're going to need to help increase the minimum wage, because that's very much part of the program of the left. In fact, they've got this very far-fetched idea that somehow companies should pay their employees more, and if they can't do it, especially the smaller ones, SMEs, the state is going to subsidize them. But I'm asking you, where is the money coming from? It's not coming from growth, is it? I've mentioned that it's at 0.2%. Okay, so where is the money going to come from? In light of the fact, and that's the other big elephant in the room, the fact that France is running a huge public deficit and a huge commercial deficit. Okay, so where's the money going to come from? I'm asking you. No one knows. So it's all those promises that they're making to French people who undoubtedly are suffering from this, sluggish economy. But there's no, like I've said, no real idea, no real action. And in fact, I've got to tell you that prior to this podcast, I spoke to a well-known economist in France called Nicolas Bouzou. And I asked him how he felt about this election and maybe the message he wanted to share with the British audience. And the message is the following. He called the programme, to quote him, dangerous and balmy.
It's so similar, Camilla, isn't it, to the debates we have here? People feel that their incomes haven't been rising as fast as they would like them to. They get angry. They react by voting for insurgent political parties. But when it comes to the actual solutions to that, they're not very apparent. There is one, now I don't want to be too divisive, but there is one upside to this for the UK, which is when investors, global investors, are looking to countries where they can safely put their money, where they can invest over the long term, they can look at the UK now and say, okay, whatever we think of the new government, it's going to be most likely there with the same Prime Minister for at least 4 years and probably 5 years, and probably the same Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's very, very clear there's a new stable future in the UK just at the time that France is starting on this magical mystery ride that you cannot see, as you say, Charlotte. You can't answer the question, who's in charge? And as soon as a country cannot answer the question, who's in charge, investors and the markets start charging you more for your debt, start saying, we're not going to invest there, because they don't know what the reaction is going to be.
And I think that's a very important point you've made here. We're talking about the EU. With France and Germany being obviously the engines, the big powers behind the whole machine. We're not exactly leading by example, are we, with our public deficit? I mean, how are we going to negotiate everything when, and I think that's actually part of the program of the left as well, and Glucksmann talked about it, they may not respect EU treaties and go over the limit that is acceptable within the Union. So what happens then?
Yeah, the EU's just
Charlotte.
opened an inquiry into the French public deficit that is at 5.1%, I think.
Yeah.
So I think it's already above.
So fights internally, fights with the EU, and possibly some scratchy fights with Britain as well. Charlotte and Adelie, thank you so much for that brilliant exposition of many of France's issues, which are so connected to what the UK is going through.
Or should we say exposition?
I knew you were going to do that, Camilla.
I hate to correct you, but it's actually exposé.
There we are.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank
Thank
you
you very
very
much for
much. Thank
having
you so
us.
much.
Sorry, it was a bit like
No,
all the
no.
talking points I
No,
had.
no.
and,
Really
you
good.
know.
Day 4 of the new Labour government.
Brave new
Camilla.
world. Loving it.
Rachel Reeves leading the charge today. She said, I mean business,
Ooh.
in her first speech as Chancellor. She also said that the UK public finances were, to put it politely, not in a great state.
I have repeatedly warned that whoever won the general election would inherit the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. What I have seen in the past 72 hours has only confirmed that. Our economy has been held back by decisions deferred and decisions ducked. Political self-interest put ahead of the national interest. A government that put party first and country second. We face the legacy of 14 years of chaos and economic irresponsibility.
2 big things she also announced. They're actually straight out of the manifesto, so no surprise, but she did say this is what we're going to do. She said the ban on onshore wind development would be stopped, reversed, and she set, as the manifesto said they would, mandatory house building targets, 300,000 a year. Exactly the same as David Cameron promised way back in 2015. And
Could
I
be
think,
more ambitious on that.
Well, could be more ambitious or actually just hit it. David Cameron, I don't think, ever hit 300,000 houses being built. I think the UK built 210,000 houses in 2023.
Rishi Sunak basically fudged it, Kamal, because they initially set that target, I think, of 300,000, and then it turned into 1 million homes in the Parliament. And then people said, well, hang on, you said it should be 300,000 and you haven't reached it. So that's how he kind of recalibrated the issue. When we see the charts of who voted for Labour, obviously they're overwhelmingly supported by the under 34s. Therefore, housing is such a key policy. And it was kind of absent, wasn't it, from the 6-point pledge plan of Starmer's. So it's great she's saying it now. But it's good politics to be really pushing on this issue. And I don't know why she wasn't more ambitious, because it's also an issue that has torn the Conservatives in two, between the YIMBYs, the yes in my backyards, and the NIMBYs, the no in my backyards. And that was kind of personified by massive rows between people like Simon Clarke, who said we have to build more, and MPs like Theresa Villiers, no, we can't concrete over the countryside. No, we can't concrete over the countryside. Incidentally, both of those Tory MPs are no more.
And of course, Michael Gove reversed the idea of mandatory local authority by local authority targets. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Labour managed to do something that the Conservatives could not achieve over 14 years. Rachel Reeves was asked directly over this issue of, but what if there is local objection to these plans? What if they're just simply rejected? Let's see how she tried to answer that question.
It will still be, in the first instance, up to local communities and local authorities to decide where housing is built. But we will bring back those mandatory housing targets, so the answer cannot always be no. So it'll be up to local communities to decide where the housing is built, but it has to be built. If the answer is always no, we'll continue as we are. And continuing as we are means living standards continuing to decline, and it means public services continuing to deteriorate. I'm not willing to accept that status quo, and so we've got to get Britain building, and we've got to ensure that families can get on the housing ladder, because it links to the second part of your question, for how home ownership is going backwards.
This is where politics of opposition and government really, the huge difference, I think, is going to become really obvious over the next 6 months, the next year. Because at the moment, Rachel Reeves is offering a Hobson's choice, i.e. you can have a choice of building these houses, or you have a choice of building these houses. Those are the only things she's actually saying.
Yeah, it just depends on how many are built over any particular period. Will Farmer from Warwickshire has written to us as a dedicated Daily Tea podcast listener. He says he listens to us while walking our Lhasa Apso dogs, Piper and Penny. Not being a member of the Kennel Club, I'm not necessarily familiar with that breed, Kamal.
I hope that Will, if you're listening, I hope you are listening, maybe you could send us a picture of your two dogs and we could put them up on Twitter, if that's okay with you. We'd love to see them.
Now known as X, just to bring you up to date.
Sorry, so sorry. I'm living in the past.
Do you know what? Should we just call it X from now on? Because we keep on saying X.
No, because I think X is such a silly name.
Okay, fine, all right. We'll revert back. We're just going to be old-fashioned about it. Anyway, Will writes, in a 2023 report, the Centre for Policy Studies estimated that we require 515,000 houses each year to meet the most recent levels of net migration, which he points out were 745,000 in 2022. In my view, this will create a political issue for Labour, as many of its voters will have backed Labour to make housing more affordable. This could also create wider disillusionment with the main political parties and increase support among young people for political parties promising much lower net migration levels, i.e. Reform UK. All the best and keep up the good work, which we'll try to do, Will. Thank you very much indeed, in Rugby with your dogs. What I found interesting is there was a lot of analysis of housing this morning, and then on the left there is this reluctance to admit that mass migration has put a huge amount of pressure on our housing stock. That is a bruise that keeps on being punched by Nigel Farage. I mean, I appreciate you think that he's making every problem that Britain is facing a problem related to mass migration, and that probably isn't the case. But on housing, why can't the left just be a bit more honest? If you're going to increase the population by millions, and this is the Robert Jenrick point, we need to build a home every 5 seconds to catch up with immigration, then you've got to have the infrastructure to back it up. And sometimes I think the left is a bit dishonest about that.
I think you can dispute whether or not you need to build this many houses because of levels of migration. And frankly, without migration, we wouldn't have had any economic growth and and much lower tax revenues to build anything. But I get the argument from Nigel Farage about immigration. I think housing is just one part of what Labour has decided is going to be a fight. Because as well as the housing target that Rachel Reeves has said there is going to be 300,000 a year, despite that being very difficult, she also resurrected planning disputes in two, very smart home counties areas around London, Buckinghamshire and Hertfordshire. Hertfordshire, of course, Camilla,
Yeah, does she want to concrete over my backyard?
Probably. I think she's eyeing up your garden.
I'm so pleased I'm pro-housing now.
But she, not just on housing, but on data centres. Now, these data centres are incredibly important because the technology infrastructure for supporting artificial intelligence, for supporting social media, for supporting the amount of power we are now demanding from all the software we use every day is so huge. They need to build these huge data centers, power centers for powering this technological revolution that we're going through. 2 had been rejected. 2 huge data centers, as I say, in Buckinghamshire and Hertfordshire had been rejected. Rachel Reeves said today she wants them to be resurrected and re-looked at. So I think this appears to me, given the strength with which Rachel Reeves made her points today, to be a big battle Labour is willing to have with what might be described, as you say, the NIMBYs.
The other battle that Labour seems willing to have is reform of the NHS. We know that Wes Streeting has flirted with the idea of bringing in more private suppliers to ease waiting lists. This appointment of Alan Milburn, who was Health Secretary under Tony Blair, is interesting, isn't it, Kamal? Because he was somebody who very much wanted to introduce more of the private sector into the NHS, perhaps quite controversial with some aspects of the left. That seems to be sort of staking a claim. In fact, I thought actually there was a very Blairite tinge to quite a lot of the rhetoric around the cabinet appointments over the weekend. Blair writes an op-ed, and Blair writes an opinion piece for the Sunday Times giving his advice to Keir Starmer. We then see the re-emergence of Douglas Alexander and Jackie Smith, both associated with the Blair-Brown era. Do we think your old mate Tony, Kamal, is advising in the background the whole time, chattering away?
I mean, you say it as if he's some evil puppet master. I mean, we said weeks ago that the Institute for Global Change, which is Tony Blair's institute, will be very influential. They do some very powerful policy work. They've got their big conference tomorrow, which I'm probably going to try and get along to. So they will be influential. Alan Milburn, you're absolutely right, is a really significant appointment. Wes Streeting has made it clear. I thought his point that the mission on health and social care, and certainly on healthcare directly, the NHS is broken. That's what he said is the mission. So therefore, everything has to be towards fixing it. That is very strong language. Then we've got this very strong language from Rachel Reeves that planning is broken and therefore we're going to do all these things. I think Labour has got quite a high tolerance for quite a lot of controversy for, I would say, the first year of this Parliament, because they have this huge majority. What are the Liberal Democrats really going to do about trying to fight back here? What are the Conservatives really going to do about trying to fight back here? I think you're right. They have to be careful about what will Nigel Farage do, because he's a proper campaigner on many of these issues. But I get a sense that there is a real tolerance for controversy. They're not going to be this crab-like, maybe rather technocratic government. They have put out some pretty aggressive positions here, and we all now have to test them on whether they actually get the right results.
Also, they're hitting the ground running, aren't they? Defence Secretary John Healey, 1 minute he's at his count, the next he's in Ukraine, taking shelter in Odessa, having met President Zelensky. I mean, that's sort of taking affirmative action. People were a bit surprised at the appointment of David Lammy as Foreign Secretary. I appreciate he was shadow. courted some controversy for a few years ago, advocating the scrapping of Trident and being hugely critical, if not rather offensively insulting, to Donald Trump. Some may agree, but some may think it's not great diplomacy. We've got a bit of movement finally on the women and equalities front. 2 ministers, we were waiting for an appointment, and then, like buses, 2 came along at once. Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, is going to also be Women and Equalities Minister, along with Annalisa Dodds. No appointment, though, for Emily Thornberry. Kamal, why do we think that is?
Not seen as a moderniser, but also I think there might be something to do with Camilla Tominey.
Well, am I taking undue credit? Look, the Ming vase was very carefully carried throughout the entire election campaign until it was dropped and sort of smashed by Emily Thornberry with me on my GB News show, because I said to her about the VAT on private school fees, whether it would mean that class sizes in the state sector would get bigger. I had asked many shadow ministers this, and they batted the question away. And then she said, yeah, maybe they will. And the Labour Party machine went absolutely nuts, and Bridget Phillipson closed her down within hours, and it was all a little bit of a controversy. They said, right, you've dropped the vase, go and get a dustpan and brush. And, here's your P45 on the way out.
Labour will have to do a little bit more housekeeping as well elsewhere. I've noticed a couple of times where government ministers on the media round don't know the detail of what Labour is not doing. So we had at the weekend, Jonathan Reynolds appeared to leave the door open to the possibility of ID cards. Tony Blair, in that piece in the Sunday Times, said he thought ID cards were a good idea as one way of possibly controlling illegal immigration. Reynolds said possibly still open. That had to be then slapped down by the middle of the afternoon on Sunday. And then we had Darren Jones this morning, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, someone who's really worth watching. He is Rachel Reeves's right-hand man. He then wasn't absolutely clear whether or not the northern leg of HS2 would continue beyond where it joins the West Coast Main Line just north of Birmingham. He wasn't clear on that. That then opened up the idea, is the government going to reopen the HS2, maybe send it to Yorkshire, I don't know, wherever. They're going to have to just do a little. They're going to need a little list of all the things they're not going to redo, because again, opposition is not government. When you're in government and you're a government minister, you need to be able to say, we're not going to do that.
Darren Jones, worth watching, but also worth secretly recording, as our colleague Gordon Rayner did when he revealed the billions it might cost
He did an interview with my old colleagues at the News Movement where he played the sax and he played Careless Whisper on the saxophone. So he's obviously got many talents.
Famously written by George Michael when he was a teenager. God rest his soul. Can I just say something controversial? I'm not too unhappy with what's been said so far. I'm quite happy with the appointment of James Timpson, the CEO of Timpson's Shoes, which has done a lot of work with rehabilitating offenders. This has sparked controversy because Timpson has previously advocated shorter prison sentences and for the prisons to be freed of people that have committed less serious crimes. I know this might shock people because some regard me as being slightly right of Genghis Khan on a number of issues, which, by the way, is a mischaracterisation. I'm very for the rehabilitation of prisoners rather than locking them up ad infinitum. I think we need to treat violent criminals differently. But if people are in prison for fraud and other offences and can be rehabilitated and actually offered meaningful work as a way out of crime, which is something that Timpson's has done, then I think it's no bad thing.
Adding to James Timpson is Patrick Vallance, the former chief scientific advisor to the government. We'll have seen him many, many times on our screens during COVID. He has now become a science minister, I think with particular responsibility for artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is such a huge issue that we'll have to come back to at some point. Again, a little whiff of the old New Labour playbook, which was government of all the talents. Remember that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair brought in a number of business advisors to help the government. So good signals, but is it going to work? So the prisons crisis is overcrowding. And what can James Timpson and others do to solve that rather than any actual minister? So a government where people in the government actually know of what they speak must be seen as at least a positive start. And just to be super clear, Camilla, I never fashion you like that.
I know.
The whole point. No, but I think
myself.
it is. No, I think it is a good point. But I see some of the appalling things that are said on X Twitter about, our positions, both of us, get attacks from either side. The whole point of what we are trying to do here is simply interrogate what we're seeing in front of us from as non-partisan a position as possible, but not to pretend that we're apolitical. We're not apolitical people. We're non-partisan people, but we do have political points of view.
And sometimes they're quite nuanced and surprising. I tell you what else is a little bit surprising, Kamal. I mean, as you'd imagine, Telegraph readers aren't exactly overwhelmingly happy with the complete and utter destruction of the Conservative Party and indeed this large Labour landslide majority. However, I'm sensing a bit of magnanimity. Paul Shepherd writes, I'm accepting the decision of the majority and looking forward to seeing positive change from the new government and not the years of stalemates on every major policy issue that we saw over the past 10-ish years. Richard Long, he's referring to Keir Starmer's press conference from Saturday. I thought it was a very good press conference. He seems pretty no-nonsense and a steady hand. If he can severely reduce mass immigration, and not just from the Tories' disgraceful record-breaking numbers, which is easy as they were so high, then I'll be pretty happy. I wish him the best of luck.
I think that many people who maybe are Conservative voters but who haven't taken the journey to reform would be thinking, and this was Rishi Sunak's point, was that you want your Prime Minister to be successful because you want your country to be successful. And nearly every Telegraph reader wants the country to be successful. So that idea that his successors are our successors, the clock is ticking on the honeymoon, but there is a honeymoon.
Should we talk about someone who's been a bridesmaid several times over, in fact 7, and then on the 8th attempt, finally became the bride? I'm of course talking about Nigel Farage being elected in Clacton, his first day as a working MP, Kamal. I mean, can you even imagine, as he has his flake 99 on Clacton Pier and considers the weight on his shoulders as somebody representing that area of Essex for the next 4 to 5 years, who else would catch up with him but our resident Daily Tea legend, Associate Editor Gordon Rayner, already name-checked on this show. That's how good this journalist is. He got alongside Farage for his first day, and this is what he found out.
I'm at the 3J's pub in Jaywick, which is just outside Clacton-on-Sea, and this is the very heart of Farage country. Nigel Farage's team believe that around 70% of voters who voted in this area voted for Reform UK, and it's not hard to see why. It's an area where there is high crime. It's an area that looks as though it could do with some investment. Certainly Nigel Farage is talking to the local council about how levelling up money might still be spent here under Labour. So Nigel Farage spent this morning talking to the chief executive of the local council. He's very much getting down to business as a constituency MP. He said that the key issues they spoke about were policing. There's a big problem here with people smoking drugs on the streets, including crack. There's a problem with antisocial behaviour. He also spoke to them about a free port in Harwich. So very different from the sort of national campaign that we saw during the election, when he was very much talking about immigration and taxation and those big national issues. It's the mood in the Farage camp is pretty ecstatic, I have to say, despite the fact that they only got 5 MPs for 4 million votes, and we've heard Nigel Farage talking a lot about how unfair he feels that was, that they could have had nearly 100 MPs if we had a different system. But he's incredibly happy that he has finally got elected. He's been down this road so many times before and failed. He's now got 5 MPs. He feels that that's something he can build on. And on tomorrow, on Tuesday, he will be going to Parliament. He opened his new MP letter just today, which he received with his instructions for what he needs to do. Very much sort of excited as a new boy at school, really. So he'll be spending his first day in Parliament tomorrow. But as far as Clacton-on-Sea goes, as we approach the 55th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing, it's very much a case of the Farage has landed.
Possibly not quite as historic as the Apollo mission, but obviously Nigel Farage will have certainly some notes in the history books as they're written. The party revealed this morning that their membership has risen to 65,000. So they are on something of a march. I think that's up 2/3 since the beginning of the election campaign. Liberal Democrats are around about 74,000. So snapping at the heels of the Lib Dems, Labour still Labour still far out in front on 432,000 and the Conservatives on about 172,000. But it's shown that he is building some form of mass movement.